What can we learn from 400 years of African American history? This is an astonishing deep dive, our Conversations with Great Minds. Check it out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. And welcome back. We're going to do a deep dive. This is just an extraordinary book. This new book, 400 Souls, edited by Ibram, Kendi, and Keisha Blain. And Keisha Blain is with us. Keisha is, or Dr. Blain, Dr. Keisha Blain, is a historian and associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, professor of African American Intellectual History Society, the president of that society, the co-editor of this new book, 400 Souls, that I just told you about, also the author of Set the World on Fire, Black Nationalist Women in the Global Struggle for Freedom, and the forthcoming Until I Am Free, the book of Fannie Lou Hamer's vision of America. Keisha Blain, KeishaBlain.com is her website. Dr. Blain, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to, if we can, during the course of this hour, just kind of chronologically go through the history of America as characterized in your book. If you want to give us just a quick summary of pulling the book together. First of all, you have many different authors and a lot of different content in it, and it is organized chronologically. If you wanted to give us just a summary of that, and then let's just jump into the early 1600s.
Sure. So the book begins in 1619, and as we explain in the introduction and even in several of the chapters, 1619 is a critical year because that's the year a group of captive Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, and the book then essentially charts the development of slavery, leads into emancipation, Jim Crow. We'll certainly talk about various periods in more depth, but then it ends in 2019, the 400-year mark, and so it is a sweeping history. We cover 400 years, but in many ways we also connect to a number of core themes that relate to American life and culture that extend to the present day.
So let's do a little deeper dive into some of these. In 1630, there was a Virginia court ruling. I've been, in fact, perhaps to put this in context, the reading that I've been doing in the last year or so has been informing me that whiteness essentially being defined not by whiteness so much as by defining limitations on people who are not white was largely the invention of the Virginians, of white people in Virginia throughout the 1600s, and by the early 1700s was fairly well established both at law and at culture. Would you agree with that? And how does the 1630 Virginia court ruling that ordered the whipping of Hugh Davis play into all that?
Yes, I certainly do agree. And in fact, I think what's clear throughout the entire text, even as we think about race in general, we're able to see, we often emphasize that race is a social construct, but I think even more so we see that it's a historical construct as well. And you're referring to just I think a brilliant essay by Ijeoma Oluo, which examines this case where a white man was essentially whipped for sleeping with a black woman. And as you point out, even in this moment, and this is very early in the first section of the book, 17th century, it's clear that there are ideas about what is accepted and what is not accepted. And what is also clear is that blackness is certainly attached, even in these early years, to certainly to the development of slavery, but even more so to scorn, to ideas of shame, and therefore when a white man in this instance ends up having relations with a black woman, he faces this public act of embarrassment because it's meant to send a message that this is something that you simply do not do, and we see as we move throughout the history how these ideas remain salient, and of course, there's a constant struggle throughout the history as it relates to even interracial unions. We know this, of course, even through the context of loving versus Virginia. So it's critical that we talk about Virginia in the 17th century, and then we end up talking about race in a later context with that court case in the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, so much of our law, so much of our history came out of Virginia. The Virginians kind of drove the process. Jefferson, Washington, Madison drove the process of creating this country, and were the heirs of this. And we're all slaveholders, of course, and we're the heirs of this invention, as it were. I understand that it really wasn't until the mid 1600s that American, or the Virginian law in particular, is kind of setting the way for the rest of the law across the United States, shifted from being bonded, people being in bondage, basically in debt, to chattel slavery, to the invention of just, a person being outright owned, and their children are owned, and period, full stop. It's always going to be this way, world without end, amen. That some or many of the people from Africa who were brought to this country involuntarily initially were bonded for shorter periods than life, and some were bonded for life, but the idea was that their heirs wouldn't be, and that really started falling apart in the mid 1600s. Is my understanding of that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in fact, there is an essay in the book which I think helps to break this down, and the reality is that this moment, this entire period, when we talk about the colonial era, it is a period, to a large extent, I wouldn't say fluidity, but there's a lot of change taking place. In fact, even as we talk about the first group of captive Africans who arrived in 1619, there is some scholarly debate. I think certainly some people would insist that we have to identify this group as enslaved. Others would say, well, not quite, but some people will say bonded. Some people will say that it wasn't clear what their fate was, that perhaps, they were going to just work for a period of years, as you point out, through a contract, and then they would ultimately be able to do something else or potentially return. The reality is that what's clear is that by the time you do get to the mid 1600s, it is no longer a question as to whether a person who is black in the territory that will become the United States, there's no question at that point whether you would have the ability to live a life of freedom. What is clear by the 1650s is that blackness is completely tied to enslavement, and there are very limited rights and opportunities. And Nakia Parker wrote an essay which she called On Free Labor, and that looks at 1654 to 1659, and it grapples with this moment of change. So you're absolutely right. I think once you get to part 2 of 400 Souls, it's no longer any murkiness about classifications of black people.
Yeah, and white people were still coming over as bonded laborers right up until the mid-1700s, arguably even into the 1800s. But right. that avenue was completely closed to anybody who was not, quote, right. white. I'm curious how the concept of privacy might tie into all of this. The idea of that was expressed in the Fourth Amendment, that people have the right to have basically security in their person, their home, their person, and their effects, and how that altered throughout the 1600s as this concept of whiteness grew and the concept of blackness grew, or is there a story there to be told?
Well, to some extent. I mean, I think we still have to think through this through the vein and the lens of slavery. And so even as you read through the narratives in the first part of 400 Souls, it's clear that Black people, even in that moment, have very few rights and opportunities. And in the end, what does privacy even look like in a moment where people do not recognize, Black Americans? Well, they certainly don't even recognize them as humans. They don't recognize them as people, and they recognize them and they see them as property. So it's hard to even think about this notion of privacy and as some sort of right that applies to all people in this particular moment, given, I think, the reality of slavery as an institution.
What about the issue of just fundamental humanity? I know that, reading some of the, well, even in Jefferson's diaries, there was this kind of pseudoscience of the day that the races were fundamentally biologically different. Where did that come from, and how has that changed over the years?
Mm-hmm. So this certainly, we can draw connections, I think, certainly to the period that you're talking about. But I also think immediately about the Bible, and I think about it as a text that people have used in both directions. One, to try to justify claims that Black people are different and therefore not to be treated as equals. And then of course, abolitionists were able to use the same text to make the complete opposite argument, to insist on Black people's humanity. And I think immediately about Chris LeBron. Chris LeBron wrote a piece in 400 Souls on the Germantown petition against slavery, which centers the role of the Quakers in particular. And one of the arguments that they make in that petition is the fact that Black people that we have to think about humanity, and that Black people are humans, and part of the challenge to slavery as an institution is the fact that it doesn't take into account their humanity. So these ideas are absolutely salient in the history, and I think of the Germantown petition in particular in the second section as an example of that.
Look, we just got the book yesterday, but my recollection of reading this years ago about Bacon's Rebellion was the moment in time when poor whites joined with some free and many not free Blacks, and engaged in rebellion. And that was kind of the point when the fathers of Virginia, as it were, said, "Holy cow, we've got to figure out a way to get poor whites to align themselves with rich whites rather than with equally poor Blacks." Is that kind of an accurate recollection of that, and was that a turning point?
Yes, in broad strokes. I think what is key about Heather McGhees' piece, she comes at it, I think, through a different angle. She certainly is framing it, as you pointed out, I think the fear that Bacon's Rebellion incited in white slaveholders, and the way that people began to think about race. We were talking about race earlier in the earlier period, and trying to avoid a situation, essentially trying to avoid a repeat whereby, poor whites would potentially ally themselves with people of African descent and overturn the entire system. So it was a turning point. I think you can frame it as such. Not only for Virginia, but I would say even just thinking about it in a broader scope, it was a turning point on a national level, even though, again, this is still an earlier period, moment of formation long before the American Revolution.
Yeah, you could say that was the moment, or one of the moments, when race and class diverged substantially?
Yes, I think so. And what Heather, I think, tried to do in that piece, which, of course, all the pieces in 400 Souls do, is get us to think not only about the historical context, but also how that connects to the present. And I can think about this even in recent months as we witness the uprisings across the nation, across the globe. There's so many moments that you can talk about as watershed moments where we see how people come together, certainly along the lines of race, but also along the lines of class, and generally how marginalized groups figure out ways to ally in order to challenge systems of oppression.
Yeah, it's just an absolutely remarkable, what I have been able to read in the book has been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to spending a lot more time with it. We will continue our conversation. We'll jump into the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries here in the last half hour of our conversation with Dr. Keisha Blain, historian, associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, president of the African American Intellectual History Society, co-editor with Ibram Kendi of the new book 400 Souls. And Dr. Blain, moving along into the 1800s here. Could you tell us about Jamel, is it Bowie, wrote a piece about black soldiers and veterans in the Civil War and the mobilization of freed people?
Yes. So we asked Jamil Bowie to write on the Civil War. And as I said earlier, it was important for us to certainly highlight key moments in this history. And there was no way we could write a book on U.S. history without grappling with the Civil War. What's important about this particular essay is the point of view that it takes. And here what it does is that it centers black soldiers in particular, their service in the war. And part of why we wanted Jamil Bowie to write this piece was to send a message about the way that black people essentially viewed the war as a window of opportunity to seize their freedom. So it wasn't about waiting for someone to set them free. We certainly can talk about key developments in the war period that aided black people's efforts, and we know this, through, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation, which made it possible for black military service to begin with. But this piece is about seeing the ways that black people asserted themselves and saw this moment as a chance to essentially make sure that their lives would be improved and that they would not have to return ever to a system of slavery.
And this was, across the country. Let's talk for a moment about the Emancipation Proclamation. I think that it's widely misunderstood. I mean, 50, 60 years ago when I was in elementary school, we learned that Lincoln freed the slaves. It wasn't anything close to that simple.
Exactly. I tell my students all the time, this is certainly an important development in the history. So I'm not suggesting that it's not an important development, but I think perhaps the most important contribution of the Emancipation Proclamation is the fact that it made it possible for black people to serve in the U.S. military. It certainly did send a message overall about the centrality of slavery when it came to the Civil War, because, of course, the rhetoric then and even now, to a large extent, there are still people who will frame it as simply a war for states' rights, and some people resist the notion that slavery had anything to do with it. But as we know, it's all deeply connected and intertwined. And so the Emancipation Proclamation ultimately was limited because it was a proclamation that, one, certainly did not apply to those who were enslaved who lived in border states. That's significant. But also it ultimately, covered those who lived in rebel territory. So it could not, be fully enforced. But what is key is that it opened up an opportunity for black people to fight in the military. And Jamil Bowie centers those voices and experiences. And I think that part of the history was important to tell in 400 Souls.
Yeah, and it's done brilliantly. To this larger point, I just kind of a personal question. I grew up in the North and lived in the North until I was in my 30s, and then we moved to Atlanta. We lived in that area for about 13 years. And I remember when my son came home from school, he must have been 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10 years old, and I said, "What'd you learn in school today?" And he said, "Oh, we're studying the War of Northern Aggression." and which just blew my mind. And I'm wondering, it's been that was in the 1980s. That was in the early 1980s. Is it still that bad? I mean, is the teaching of American history that calcified, that rigidified by 400 years of white supremacy and control over history?
Well, I think it absolutely depends on where you live, where you attend school. One of the things that's clear is that, for example, Texas comes to mind as a state where there is still to this very day a battle over how educators can talk about the Civil War or even slavery in general. There are still textbooks that do not fully explain the horrors of slavery. Tries to talk about it in a way that's quote unquote fair and balanced. Well, there's no balanced assessment of slavery. It was a terrible institution and it was wrong. And there's still battles taking place. I think depending on various states are debating these concerns. So there's still progress. I would hope it's not as bad as the example you give in the 1980s, but this does not mean that we're at a place where students are fully grasping this history. And I think to this very day, you can meet people who will resist the notion that, for example, that the Civil War has anything to do with slavery because of the way that they were taught in high school and even in some colleges too.
Yeah, and I should add, it wasn't the Atlanta public school system. We were living in Cobb County, Georgia. Our U.S. representative was Newt Gingrich, and this was in Marietta, Georgia, suburban Atlanta at the time. Tell me about the Great Migration. Isabel Wilkerson writing about this in your book 400 Souls. We're talking with Dr. Keisha Blain.
Yeah, so of course, I think it's impossible to even study the Great Migration without engaging the work of Isabel Wilkerson. So she was the first person that we thought of to write this piece. And what we wanted to do in a similar fashion, I think it's clear the theme of Black agency runs through the text. And this chapter, in a similar way, helps people see how Black people came together in mass to resist a system of, in this particular case, a system of Jim Crow segregation and violence and terror, and collectively resist by moving, by exploring opportunities outside of the South and bringing their families, working together through networks and institutions to try to make a better life for themselves. So in a similar way, if you look at the piece on the Civil War and you look at the piece of the Great Migration, what you see is Black autonomy, decisions being made at an individual level, but even a collective vision that is connected to a vision of seeking rights and liberation at a moment where there's so much violence and so much resistance and white backlash, which we certainly see throughout the history.
What is the lingering echo of that? Is it occasionally it gets referenced in the context of large Black populations in Detroit or in Philadelphia, things like that. Is that the principal echo, or are there others?
Well, I think it's more so just a constant struggle among Black communities, and I think even the constant struggle among Black people to try to figure out how to improve their social conditions. And so the piece by Isabel Wilkerson is looking at the Great Migration and focuses specifically on a movement primarily from south to north and also to the west. But there are other narratives, too, that even think beyond U.S. borders. And here we think about immigrationist movements, and you have, African Americans historically, but even to this very day, who decide, we are tired of the racism, we're tired of the violence, the oppression, and we want to explore, new lands and new opportunities beyond U.S. borders to try to improve our conditions. So you see these, I think, recurring themes. Even in the current day, just even the last 4 years, there were many people who said, well, maybe the answer is simply to leave if we're not going to see things improve on U.S. soil.
Is it your sense that things are improving now, post-Trump? We just have 30 seconds to the break.
Right. A bit. I think there's a lot left to do, but I think we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, one hopes. I mean, I just don't see how anybody can call Trumpism anything other than just naked white supremacy, you know, openly, blatantly, aggressively, proudly, you know, as in the Proud Boys, and that kind of thing, sadly. We're talking with Dr. Keisha Blain, the historian and associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, and most consequentially, in the context of this conversation, the co-editor of this book, 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019. We'll be kind of leading this conversation by asking you about parts of the book that piqued my curiosity. I'm in the 4 minutes roughly we have until we hit another break. I'm curious, what part of the book do you feel the most excited, enthusiastic about, or would most like to share with people?
Well, there's an essay in the book written by a philosopher by the name of Catherine Sophia Bell. She's a professor at Penn State. And it's an essay on Mariah Stewart, who was an abolitionist and a feminist, ultimately from the city of Boston, living there in the 1830s. And I particularly love that piece because it helps us see the connections between past and present, and particularly, I think, just the power of Black women's leadership. One can draw the connections between Mariah Stewart and the work of, the courageous Black women who established Black Lives Matter, for example. And so that piece resonates with me. And just like I said, it captures Black women's political leadership. We've seen that, of course, even in electoral politics over the last couple of months. We've seen the critical role of Black women in Georgia and other places, making it possible for us to experience, I think, significant changes on a national level. So that's a piece that I love and hope people will find much, I think, inspiration as they read it.
Is there a particular story in there that you could tell in a little less than a minute?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll simply say that what's powerful is Mariah Stewart stood up in Boston before mixed audiences of, white and Black people to demand Black rights and political autonomy at a moment where millions of Black people were still enslaved, primarily in the U.S. South. And so that was a bold move. It was a courageous move, and it was a dangerous move. But it spoke to her courage and her passion, and I think we certainly can find inspiration in that story.
Yeah, and we so need our stories. I mean, it's stories are the underpinning of culture, and we have a great collection of them here in 400 Souls, edited by Ibram, Kendi, and Dr. Keisha N. Blain. We'll be back in just a moment. We're going to hit a break here in just a second or two. We'll be back in just a moment. I want to get up to the 20th century here. We have a full minute. I'm sorry. I'm misreading my clock, Dr. Blain. Would you like to add to that story, or is there another story you'd like to share with us in this last minute?
Well, I think another piece that I would highlight is a piece by Tara Hunter on the city of Atlanta, and this is a piece that looks at 1874 to 1879. And again, what's key in this essay is just centering Black women, the way that working class Black women came together in the city to really build community and to establish themselves in the aftermath of the Civil War. I think one can find similarly, hope and inspiration in these narratives, individuals who had very little, but still had a vision, bold visions, and worked toward that within their communities. And, within institutions, including churches and clubs. And so I think it's the kind of story that resonates with us today.
Stories of bravery and resilience and extraordinary inspiration. We'll be right back with Dr. Keisha Blain, historian and associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, president of the African American Intellectual History Society, co-editor with Ibram Kendi of the new book, 400 Souls. Welcome back. We're speaking with Dr. Keisha N. Blain, the co-editor of A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019, titled 400 Souls. Dr. Blain, to bring us closer to the present moment, decades. Angela Davis wrote about the devastation caused by the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. Talk about that and how things have changed and not changed from basically the 80s, the so-called Reagan Revolution, to this moment.
Yes, and so I think this piece, just similar to so many others, help us see how we got to this particular moment. We see the ways that Black people have been criminalized, and Black and brown people in particular have been criminalized in U.S. society. And you're asking what has changed? Well, a lot has not changed, and we see that particularly because over the last couple of months, with the uprisings and the constant struggle, the constant challenge of dealing with police violence and brutality, what happens every time there is a case that makes it to the national level, whether we're talking about George Floyd most recently, is that Black people enter in every space, in public spaces, even in private spaces, or criminalized, and it leads to these encounters, which, as we know, are deadly. So a lot has not changed, and I think that's part of what 400 Souls captures is, yes, we can talk about progress, but we can also talk about the continued struggles in society and anti-Black racism, state-sanctioned violence. These are challenges that remain persistent to this very day. And so the story that Davis unfolds helps set the stage, I think, in many ways for where we are today.
What was the genesis of this legislation, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act? How did this come about? I mean, this is the one that, if I'm recalling correctly, this is the bill that Joe Biden is apologizing for his role in.
Well, as a historian, I would argue that the origins actually go back pretty far, and it goes to the period of slavery. And I think I always remind my students that when you think about even the criminalization of Black people, or if you think about police violence, for example, it's not solely a 20th century story, or even a 19th century story. It's one that comes directly from the history of slavery and all of these patrols and that were established in the aftermath of the Civil War that attempted to control Black people's lives and their movements. And so when you have a movement, when you have an institution, rather, that comes out of that history, it's therefore not surprising that you would have all of these developments, even later into the 20th century, that seek to further criminalize Black people. And so, yes, one can talk about Joe Biden's role, certainly, but I want to think about it even in a broader and a longer sense throughout history, in the way that we have been creating a society that criminalizes some groups and ultimately empowers police forces to continue this, devastating string of police killings and so on. So I think one can think of it through that lens.
Yeah, particularly the police in the South, in many cases, just coming straight out of the old slave patrols. Right. Where do we go? We have about 2 minutes, I think, here. Where do we go forward? What are the things that are giving you hope as you're looking out at America's political landscape right now? I mean, this morning in the House, we had Republicans basically trying to blame the January 6th problem on Black Lives Matter. I mean, literally blaming it on Black Lives Matter. This is not going away.
Right. Unfortunately, I think I'm hopeful because, as you mentioned earlier, it certainly for me, it's meaningful that we no longer have Donald Trump in office, and certainly I'm not suggesting that within your administration that everything is perfect and all of a sudden we can celebrate and go on our merry way. We still have a ton of work to do, but it's meaningful when there are people in office who at least espouse a commitment, at least they articulate a commitment to building an inclusive democracy. The key is going beyond words and expressions and stated commitments to actual policies. So part of what we have to do, I think all of us as American citizens, we have to continue to push and demand that promises are kept. But it's a hopeful time to have people in office who are not trying to agitate further and encourage white supremacists.
There you go. Dr. Keisha Blain, thank you so much for dropping by today. It's been fascinating speaking with you, and it's an extraordinary book. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. The book, again, 400 Souls, edited by Keisha Blain and Ibram Kendi, and a subtitle, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019. Check it out. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires